Let's start with the background. I'll try to give you a picture of how I see light communications and where I see their place or the value, and it's going to be from a little bit of industrial perspective, hence I'm at the beginning of an industrial tutorial. If you talk to any of my colleagues, they can give you a little bit different flavor of the story, but I think at the same time we'll be all looking at the final phase of our industrial, or let's say the current phase of industrial evolution, right? So a little bit of historic perspective. The first thing comes with steam. The minute James Watt invented more efficient steam engine, we were able to automate or use non-human power to make factories work. Once that got to the level of mass production, we're talking about a second phase of industrial revolution. So car assembly line are a primary example, and electrification made it yet another more efficient phase in production. So then computers came in, right? So you can start automate, you can start using sort of processing power to manage these large-scale processes that so far were just simply driven by human. Very efficient, but these are still human-based processes. Here we're getting finally automation, computers running everything, but this is all still done by cable. Not sure if anyone was, whenever we was in a factory where these huge arms are operating. This weighs 2 tons, has a big box, 5 servers, 5 racks there with all the processing power. This thick cable's coming out of it, and it costs a couple of millions. It can pack a package almost like humans, but it's incredibly expensive, and it needs to talk to brain somewhere out there. It does a lot of things in a pre-programmed manner, but my point is this is not well connected. This is depending on this is ultra sensitive. Everything needs to be perfectly synchronous. Something happens, the whole assembly line stops. This costs fortunes. So what we now want is to replace cables A. We want to have reconfigurable factories. We want these big things to start moving. We want them to be connected reliably over wireless, and we would like now to start having these smart functions such as self-adaptation, self-optimization. Sounds like old concepts, but getting it to work is really hard, right? So the current phase of the industrial revolution is IoT, or let's say the digitalization of it, the production of digital twins. Let's say you have a factory with the physical space being completely mirrored into the digital domain, and then you're doing all the automation that you're then projecting back to the reality. This is already happening. We have concepts for that. You can imagine how tight requirements this will have on communications. Ultra HD up, quick decisions on the downlink, 5 nines of reliability. No packet can get lost. If something gets lost, big problem. It needs to be smooth. The minute you have people using VR, it has to be very, very nice, right? So this is the vision that's accepted by industry. It's happening, and it poses a lot of challenges in terms of technology. So let me start talking about the networking aspects. I had a student the other day who didn't know what is this. Is anyone does not know what is this? Just a reminder, this is a formula that actually one of the guys in Bell Labs came up with, Claude Shannon. It's a formula that summarizes the maximum achievable capacity in a Gaussian channel. It's an abstraction of what could happen if I'm communicating over either wireless or landline interface. The reason I want to mention it here is to show or remind you again of the key parts of it. Bandwidth. The more bandwidth I have, the faster I can send my data. It's a linear relationship. What I want you to pay attention to now is the fact that this is a linear dependence. Signal to noise ratio, right? Noise is always there. If I crank up power, I get more data through, but on a logarithmic scale, right? So now if you want to look at new technologies, if you want to make smart networks work in a more efficient manner, and we're talking about 10 times more. We're not talking about moving from 50 megabit to 100 megabit. We're talking about 5, 10, 50 gigabit per second. Uncompressed HD video is at least 600 megabit per second. Then we need to think about concrete technologies. So we say that spectrum reuse. These are, by the way, studies that evaluated technologies for the last 20, maybe 30 years. And these are the net gains in terms of improvement of capacity with respect to some baseline, a cable, Ethernet cable. We can see that bandwidth can yield up to 10x improvement in terms of communications, right? So most of the gains that we have nowadays, thanks to LTE, is simply bandwidth. There's nothing really fancy about it. The more bandwidth I have, the faster I can send data. It's a linear relationship. This implies, though, spectrally use. We need to be able to reuse that bandwidth with little interference, right? That's where it gets interesting. So we start talking about efficient technologies. in terms of coding modulation efficiency, but those are very, very saturated, very quickly yielding incremental or diminishing returns. So all these MIMO techniques and so on are great, but we're reaching their potential. We are 3 dB from channel limit, so we're not going to move very far. So shall we invest into physical layer? Well, we need to be very careful what we're talking about because we're doing pretty much what's possible, right? So these two triangle parts are an interesting one. Reuse. And MIMO, again, in a sense, is a reuse technique. More bandwidth, always needed. You never get wrong with this one, as simple as that. But you need to also pay attention to reuse, right? So these are the takeaways that I want you to take away from the state of the art for radio frequency, right? Saturated not physical layer, in a sense, I don't want to dismiss that. It's still very important. But bandwidth and reuse are the key to move forward 10 times more, right? So let's talk about bandwidth. This is the spectral mask for US, ranging from sub 6 giga all the way up to 30 giga, millimeter wave 5G. It's packed. Now tell me where I get 10 times more bandwidth in order to go 10 times, 50 times faster. We're not going to get it. They moved the radar bands, the military ones, with a lot of hassle. We've seen a lot of big players killing each other for a little bit of spectrum in the 3.5 giga bandwidth. Verizon's were completely squeezed out by Google because each of them has a different vision for that little Wi-Fi band, and now the big giants are killing each other. Meanwhile, it simply doesn't matter for anyone else because there's still not space anyway, right? So there's really big players fighting for little chunks of bandwidth, and that's not going to make any difference, right? So we have spectrum, but we need to allocate it, and that's not going to happen, right? Yes?
So do you have any idea, Stepan, about how much of that, the utilization of each part? Because some people, of course I'm in favor of VLC, but some people claim, hey, look, there's some of this spectrum that is given to, let's say, radio, TV, or some companies, but the utilization is so low that you can still jump into there. So you have any idea of the average utilization that we have? Some of them, like Wi-Fi, of course, super crowded, but what about the others?
It comes down to reliability. So utilization, yes, someone's not using the band, so you may jump in, use it, but now that guy, the primary guy, is coming back, and now what happens, right? And it comes down to reliability. If it's a military radar, like the one in 3.5 giga in the US, you will not jump in. Finished. End of story. Because if the military says, I don't feel comfortable with you in the band, you might one day somewhere interfere. That's it. Finished. So what it means, we need some kind of coordination servers, that's some infrastructure around the management of the spectrum. So yes, we can reuse the spectrum, but the question is how? And that's still a tricky question because, again, if I am to use military bands, I need to know when the military is using the bands. That's pretty bad because that means if they're using the band, the big aircraft areas are in port somewhere close by, and I know, right? So this has a lot of implications. Getting this very simple idea is tough. Cognitive radio, 30 years of research, not much has been done such that it convinces industry to get it work. It's tricky. I myself thought a couple of years ago it's a very simple thing. Just get the servers, whatever. Then I see my colleagues going to FCC back and forth. It's not happening. It's just very, very difficult. And the problem is that you have the big players using all their muscle to get those little bands. It's a very, very, very precious research. So people like Amazon and Google will crush big players like Verizon, imagine that, in order to get their little Wi-Fi access points deployed in New York in those old booths and have their free internet and ads sold to people versus Verizon who wants that band for something else. And we're just going to watch that. We're not even going to say anything into that. So yes, you're right. Theoretically, it makes sense. Practically, there's so many things. So if you want a breakthrough, if you want 10 times more capacity, and I'm constantly kind of giving you motivation for the light story, right? You need to do something out of the box. This is very painful. That's the living point of my slide. Even if we allocate, let's talk about the next slide. You should synchronize across countries. So let's talk about Wi-Fi bands, right? So what are the free bands? Every country has that horrible messed up chart that I showed in the previous slide. Now, what you would like to do is produce some chipsets in one country and export it to the other one without any modifications. Filters, antennas, everything should be the same, right? You don't want to produce for different country different things. It would be very expensive. And you lose the kind of the benefit of the economy of scale, producing 1 million chipsets for the entire world in a day, right? Now, you see the ISM bands, the experimental bands, are not really well synchronized in this frequencies domain across multiple countries. And that's just Wi-Fi. That's the kind of experimental bands where nothing really matters. You know, there's no promise of guarantee of any sorts. They're trying to add some bands that are kind of synchronized, but again, it's a painful process. And this is a political power play. I mean, this is beyond technology, so I'm not really... Plus, actually, the technology is actually very, very tough as well. And the legal aspects and the military, the minute you talk about reliability, interference, again, I never really believed interference. I was like, what is the problem? There's so much interference. Things are jammed in a horrible way. Again, if you just see it yourself in real, you can start understanding there are people looking at this full time and they're still doing a good job, right? So it's tough. Interference is a reality. Coordination, allocation of spectrum is painful. Yet another example, 5G bands in the world. These are the free chunks for 5G all over the world. See, it's kind of scattered. We're never really going to have some kind of nice overlapping band. And if we have one, it's going to be tiny, right? Don't get mistaken. That intersection can do 100 megabit per second on 5G air access, 3.5 gigahertz over 2 kilometers. Those are 4x4 MIMO. Those are the state-of-the-art numbers. But is 100 mega enough? What do you think? Right? So streaming HD video, if I want 0 delay, I can't use graphics card. Uncompressed 600 megabit per second, single user. You want VR headsets, move your hand freely, it needs to be actually multiple streams delivering individual points. You know, so you can easily fill the band. You can quickly imagine that you can start wasting capacity in a way, way faster manner than these guys are allocating leftovers of spectrum from unused military radars. They're not used, yes. TV, 700 megabit per second. So, sorry, 700 megahertz. Very good propagation. How much bandwidth is there, really? Right, so that's the other free band. So, finally, how about looking at light? Right? It's a free resource, in a way. It's still electromagnetic spectrum, by the way. Still the same way of delivering energy and information as any other frequency. It's just 100 times higher frequency than anything we've been so far using, even more, 1,000 times, if you like. Right? So it's an interesting, out-of-the-box thought. Can we have a look seriously at this? And a couple of people have been looking at it. There is representatives in this room of companies who are doing very, very great in this domain. So it's a serious business, right? Now, what can we do with light, right? Or why should we pay attention to that? Again, so I'm going to first try to motivate before we go into the details. And my colleagues will do a great job trying to explain what they're doing. It's a lot of amazing stuff. But we're still far away from light being the mainstream, right? At this stage, I am at the level where I'm saying, let's pay attention to light, right? It's an interesting resource we should use because we don't have any other, right? And if you think about it, it's a radically different way of delivering information. It's a completely different technology. We're talking about silicon LEDs. We're talking about microelectronics versus filters, antennas, you know, phase shifters and all that stuff. So it's a quick thought that has serious implications. That's the bad news. You need to redesign everything. You need to convince the market. You need to go out, fight for it. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for serious innovation. So if you're the early adopter, first pioneer, you know, you can have very critical IPR. Again, I'm using the corporate vision here, but you know, you can have impact, right? So let's talk about what that could be. By the way, what time is it?